Aloha and welcome to this recording of Bible Study Lite here at Kona Bible Church in Kailua, Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii. Bible Study Lite is something that we developed here at Kona Bible Church. It really came out of COVID when, because of the lockdown, we weren't able to do sort of the traditional types of Bible studies. But we like it so much, we're going to keep doing it. And it's basically a very low-key, once-a-month study. There's no homework, there's no preparation, there's no cost. We just select a verse from the Bible or a concept from the Bible. We study God's Word for a little bit. We get together. We have a couple options. We meet in person once a month. And the in-person meeting is usually on a weeknight evening. And now we're meeting back at the church here at Kona Bible Church. And then if that doesn't work for you, we also have a Zoom option, which we're going to continue, even though COVID's hopefully on its way out. And the Zoom session is generally on a weekday during the morning. And so you have the opportunity to participate live in either of those two options. If that doesn't work for you, we do record the presentation part of each Bible Study Lite. We put it on Kona Bible Church's webpage as well as the YouTube channel, and you can get the written material there too. You don't get to participate in the fellowship and the exchange and the back and forth, which is really kind of fun, but it's still an option. And we are getting caught up. We will be resuming our Bible Study Lite. We took a break over the summer, but we're starting up again in September of 2021. If you'd like to join us in person or on Zoom, please reach out to me. I'm Dee Dee Tully, and my email will come up at the end of this presentation. And shoot me an email, and I'll get you on our list, or reach out to the church, and we can get you on our list, and you can participate with us in person. We'd love to have you, or on Zoom. We'd love to see you on the screen, or if not, we'll hopefully you'll just keep watching the recorded versions here on the webpage. So this Bible Study Lite is entitled, "Blessed Are the Peacemakers, a Conversation." Well, it's not going to be much of a conversation because I'm here by myself recording this, and all I've got is a camera. But it was a great conversation when we had this in person and on Zoom, and I still think it's worth doing a recording because there's some background and some insights and some questions that you can ponder, and I think this is something that's definitely worth investing some time and effort into. And blessed are the peacemakers is one of the Beatitudes. It's from Matthew chapter 5. And this particular Bible Study Lite topic is just a little bit different. We spend a lot of time, the Bible is replete with wonderful ways that God has communicated His love, His provision, His guidance, His love over and over again for His people. And those are all encouraging, and there's certainly plenty of blessings that come out of that. But the flip side of that coin is, there are some responsibilities and obligations that come as being a follower of Christ. And we need to think about those, and we need to talk about those, and we need to explore those, because that is part of being a Christian. And so here we're talking about being a peacemaker, which can be a little bit difficult or awkward or uncomfortable, but I think it's something that we definitely need to look into. If we're gonna enjoy the benefits, we have to take seriously the responsibilities that come for being one of His daughters. The Sermon on the Mount. This is in Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. This is the longest discourse, actually, it's Jesus preaching. It's 3 chapters of Jesus talking, and it's the longest preach or sermon that He does in the entire Bible. And it really emphasizes, the Beatitudes are just one part of the Sermon on the Mount, but the entire Sermon on the Mount, those 3 chapters, really talks about what Jesus values. This is what He is looking at early on in His ministry, and He's explaining to people what are the important things to Jesus and to being a follower of Jesus. And within the Sermon on the Mount, there is the Beatitudes, what we've now called the Beatitudes. We'll talk about what that word means in a minute. There's 8 of those. Those are blessed are. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. And we are just looking at one of the Beatitudes, which is blessed are the peacemakers. But notice that Jesus said peacemaker. He didn't say peacekeeper, and he didn't say peace hoper or peace dreamer or peace desirer. He said peacemaker. It's a very active verb. It requires something affirmative that we do. And this is something that I think is worth exploring here and what we'll talk about. When you say peacemaker, and it's kind of an obscure word, it only occurs once in the entire Bible, and that's here in Matthew chapter 5:9. Well, what does that mean? Who are we supposed to make peace with? What does it mean? How are we supposed to do it? That's a pretty good question. And we'll talk about that. We'll explore that. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is when you're thinking about, okay, do I have to be a peacemaker? I think there's one thing we can agree on is that there is a lot of chaos out there right now. I'm recording this in the summer of 2021. We're coming off a pandemic. Are we going back into it? We don't know. Our communities, our states, our nation, the world is full of strife and violence and polarization and difficulties and chaos. There's just a lot of chaos out there, and God hates chaos. And part of what he's charging us to do is to try and help address this chaos by being a peacemaker. Again, we'll talk all about this in a minute here. But I think it's something to keep in mind that there is an antidote to the chaos out there. And it's a responsibility we have, not just sitting back and waiting for God to solve the world's problems that his own children create, but that we have this obligation to take being a peacemaker because it embodies Jesus and reflects him, and we strive to imitate him. And so being a peacemaker as a way of addressing the chaos is something that I believe Jesus is really charging us to do. And it can be difficult, and it can be uncomfortable, and it can even be costly, but I think it's worth it. So let's dive in. Let's dive into Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. But if you've ever watched any of my Bible Study Lite presentations or attended any of the Bible Study Lite sessions we've had, you know that I always start with background and context. And as powerful and wonderful and beautiful as the words in the Bible are, understanding the background and the context can make it even more powerful and more profound. So let me take a step back here and talk a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount. Again, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. It's not in any of the other Gospels. There's something sort of similar, kind of, in Luke that they call the Sermon on the Plain, maybe. It's not clear if that's the same sermon, Luke just reporting on the same sermon, or if that was something different. But you'll only see the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And this takes place pretty early in Jesus' ministry. So he's just coming out of his 40 days experience in the wilderness, where he went on a spiritual retreat to prepare for his ministry, where he was tempted by the enemy multiple times. He's finished that. He comes out of that, and he's baptized by John the Baptist. He gathers his disciples, and he's just starting to speak to the people, to spread his teachings in and around Galilee. And he's becoming very popular very quickly, and crowds are following him. So he goes up on the mount. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to the Holy Land, the area around Galilee, or seen photos of it. But when we're saying the Sermon on the Mount, it probably wasn't much of a mount. It was certainly not Mauna Kea like we have here on the Big Island. It's a fairly flat terrain, and it's probably a fairly small little rise of a hill that he went on, but it's so that people could hear him. And again, it's the longest single time where Jesus speaks. So this is pretty important just in and of itself right there. This is Jesus speaking. And he's not really talking specifically about salvation. A lot of his ministry was to spread the good news of God coming, of Jesus coming to serve and to save, to provide salvation to humanity. But the Sermon on the Mount really focuses a little bit more on God's righteousness, the righteous way to live, and how, if you're in God's family, these are sort of the qualities that he wants you to embody. It's really kind of Jesus saying, you need to believe in me, and if you do, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And if you want to walk the walk, this is kind of how the walk looks like. So it's an important summary from Jesus of what he values, and it has a strong emphasis on the righteousness of God and how we are striving, he wants us to strive to imitate that. And that righteousness, it really is just Jesus sort of inviting the people, inviting us into his kingdom. Not just his kingdom here on earth, but in the future age as well. So the Sermon on the Mount has quite a different number of connotations and different levels, but it really is a great summary of what's important to Jesus. And as I said earlier, one part of the Sermon on the Mount is what we now call the Beatitudes, which is a Latin word. So you're not going to find that word in your Bible. The New Testament was written in Greek. Beatitude is something, it's just a summary. It's just a word that somebody coined later to characterize what are these 8 blessings. So Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. Those 8 blessings became what we now call the Beatitudes. And that comes from a Latin word, beatus. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but I'm going to say it anyway, beatus. And beatus means happy and rich in blessings. So this is Jesus talking about that. Let me take a little sidestep here and share with you a fun fact. So in 1958, Jack Kerouac, the American writer, coined the term the Beat Generation. And he got that. He was reading a Bible, oddly enough, and he looked up beatitude and saw that it was from the Latin beatus, and that it meant very, very happy and very rich in blessings. And that's what he wanted that generation to experience. It was to be happy and rich in blessings. Now, culturally, it took on a much different term, and as we recall it now, but that was Jack Kerouac's source for the term Beat Generation, beatus. So Jesus starts out with these Beatitudes on this sermon. And, his sermon is, the Beatitudes may sound a little puzzling or confusing to us in the 21st century, but they would not have to his first century listeners. Jesus is using concepts from the Old Testament. He's even using words from the Old Testament that are familiar to the Jewish people who are listening to him at that time. But he's putting a different emphasis on the words, a little bit of a different spin, if you will, different set of ideals. And so his listeners would have recognized some of these words, some of these phrases, some of these concepts, but they are a different emphasis. And the Beatitudes to us may seem a little confusing. So, for example, we sit there and we say, happy are those who mourn, or blessed are those. Some of you may have Bibles that translate blessed to happy. And you're thinking, wait, happy are those who mourn? blessed are those who mourn. I don't feel particularly happy or blessed when I'm mourning. And that's not necessarily how those people in the first century would have heard that. This was a construct, something that they were familiar with. And if you break down a beatitude, it's really two parts. So there's a condition, and then there's a result. And so the condition is you're mourning, or you're thirsting for righteousness, or you're a peacekeeper. That's your condition. And then there's the result. So the result is if you're mourning, that you will see God, or if you're a peacekeeper, you will be a child of God, or if you are thirsting for righteousness, you will be filled. So condition and result, but it's not an immediate result, and that's something that's a little foreign to us in this day and age, when we are so used to immediate. It's like, I do this, I get that, right? It's instantaneous. That's how we sort of see and want things to work. And that's not how it worked in the ancient times. And so the beatitude, the result was not immediate. It was much more of a long-term commitment. And his listeners would have appreciated that. They would have understood that. What we really are seeing is Jesus asking us in these Beatitudes to reorient our values and our vision and our habits, even our habits. And he's kind of de-emphasizing the external righteousness. That was something associated with the Pharisees, this sort of external show of righteousness. And what he's really looking at, what he's really saying and looking for from us is wholeheartedness, a wholeheartedness love of God, to follow God wholeheartedly. And so not a Pharisee legalistic thing, but really following God with your whole heart and all of the abundant grace and blessings that flow from that. So it really is you have to take a longer term view of these Beatitudes. It's not boom, boom. It's you do this, and you realize the end result. And I think that's a theme that goes throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount. And I think that's why the Sermon on the Mount ends in chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. It ends with Jesus sharing the parable of the wise and the foolish builder. So what Jesus says is, if you hear my words and you put them into practice, you are like a wise builder who builds his house on a rock. And it's solid. It's got a good foundation. And when the tides rise and the storms rage and the wind blows, that house stands because it's built on a rock. This is what happens if you hear my words and put them into practice. You're a wise builder. You've put your house on a rock. He contrasts that to the foolish builder, the builder who hears his words but does not put them into practice. That is like a builder who puts his house on the sand. And so when the tides rise and the winds blow and the storms rage, the house is blown away if you don't put these things into practice. You need to take the long view for the Sermon on the Mount in general, and specifically for the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers who shall become children of God is a long-term commitment and an attitude and approach. So let's just look at one of the Beatitudes. I mean, we could do a Bible study light on each one. Well, we're just today looking at blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Okay, so blessed are the peacemakers. Well, peacemakers with who? Who are we supposed to make peace with? And the Greek word here for peace is, I'm probably going to massacre this, but I'm going to say it anyway, eirene, and it just means quietness or restfulness. And peacemaker, as I mentioned earlier, is a very obscure word. It's the only time it's used in the Bible is here, And it reads, not surprisingly, is basically a founder or a promoter of peace. So, okay, we now know what peace is and what a peacemaker is, but who are we supposed to make peace with? And it's interesting because commentators in the Bible have come up with some different interpretations, and there are some who believe what Jesus was really talking about was peace with God. You need to be a peacemaker with God. It's up to us to make peace with God, to reconcile with God. There are others, probably more common, who said, no, Jesus is really talking about being a peacemaker with the people around you, right here and now on earth. John Wesley, the theologian, said this about the verse. He said, peacemakers endeavor to calm the stormy spirits of men, to quiet their turbulent passions, to soften the minds of contending parties, and if possible, reconcile them to each other. So John Wesley is like, no, Jesus was telling us to try and be peacemakers so that we can reconcile ourselves to one another. Other commentators say it's both. You need to make peace with God first, and then you can make peace with others. Here's what Thomas Merton said about Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. We are not at peace with others because we are not at peace with ourselves. And we are not at peace with ourselves because we are not at peace with God. So Thomas Merton is sort of saying there's kind of three steps there. We need to make peace between ourselves and God, reconciliation with God. Then we get peace in within ourselves, and now we can go out and make peace between others. And Gregory of Nyssa had another step or layer to it. So Gregory of Nyssa was this pretty cool theologian. He lived in the 300s A.D., and he's kind of interesting because he's a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Lutheran Church, in a couple of the Orthodox churches. It's unusual for a saint to be a saint in all of these different denominations, but Gregory of Nyssa managed to do that, and he was really an interesting theologian. And he said you need to make peace with God, peace with each other, and then you do that so that you can help others make their peace and seek their reconciliation with God. And he called that godly work and said it was an imitation of God's love of man. So whatever your interpretation of this particular verse is, I look at it and I say, okay, who's talking here? Well, it's Jesus. And I guess I'm kind of coming down with Thomas Merton and Gregory of Nyssa, which is, hey, we need to have peace with God. We need to reconcile that first and foremost, then peace with ourselves. I think that's something that perhaps we often overlook. Then we can make peace with others. We can become a peacemaker with others around us with the goal of making peace, but also helping them to reconcile them with God. So that's the who of the peacemaker. And I take the broad view of it, that we do have an affirmative obligation to make peace with those around us. Okay, and why? Why do we need to be a peacemaker? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's an awful lot of chaos out there. And I believe Jesus is telling us that we have a responsibility to address that chaos. And perhaps one way to look at this, an interesting way to look at this, is to look at the Hebrew word for peace, which you're probably more familiar with. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And the great thing about Hebrew is it's on so many different, it's a language that has so many different levels. And so there's the literal translation of shalom, and just means peace. And then there's a more metaphorical, if you will, translation of peace, of shalom, which means it's not just an absence of conflict, but it's to make oneself whole. And then what's so fascinating about Hebrew is each of the letters that make up a word, in this case shalom, but each letter is what linguists call a pictograph. So it kind of tells a little story. It has a meaning. Each letter has a meaning. And when you look at the letters that constitute shalom, the meaning is this. It's the divine presence of God which binds up, hems in, or locks up the leader of chaos. Fascinating description and definition. So not only just peace, not only just wholeness, but this effort, this affirmative action to address the chaos that's out there and to do something to hem it in, to corral it, to fence it, to give it some boundaries. That now you start to sort of see, okay, this is maybe what being a peacemaker is all about, is to somehow address the chaos. Now, we're never going to make the chaos go away. Only God can do that. But we can address the chaos, and we can start to try and tame it. I love the binds up, hems in, or locks up the leader of chaos. Now, who loves chaos? Well, it's not God, okay? God, if you go back to Genesis, God, there was chaos and darkness in the world, and he made order and light. So God loves order and light. He dislikes chaos. But who does love chaos? Well, the enemy, and that's who can exploit the chaos to thwart God's plan. So if God wants to quench what he dislikes, chaos, if he wants to somehow tame that chaos, how's he going to do it? Well, he's going to use us. He's going to use us as his offspring. Because again, you go back to Genesis 1, verses 26 to 27, God made us in his own image. And not only did he make us in his own image, but he made us rulers of the earth and the seas and the animals on the earth and the skies, the birds in the sky. So in effect, we are co-rulers, at least here on earth, with God of what he has given us dominion over. We are co-rulers, not equal to him by any stretch, but we are co-rulers. And I want you to think about being a co-ruler, because that comes with some pretty great blessings and provision and wonderful benefits, but it also comes with some responsibilities. And I was listening to a sermon not too long ago where the speaker was talking about being co-rulers with God and said, you know, the next time you see a situation where you're like, this is just chaotic, God, what are you going to do about this? You know, look at this. What are you going to do about it? Maybe we need to be also asking ourselves, what are we going to do about it? If we are co-rulers and we have some responsibilities, are we doing anything about it? It's something to think about. So if we are a peacemaker and we are trying to make peace with others, and we're trying to do it to tame this chaos, and you see God using us, his children, his co-rulers, we're carrying, you know, he's the Prince of Peace. He has the government, he has all government authority on his shoulders, and he's using us, wanting us to identify as peacemakers so that others can see that we are indeed the children of God. He wants the earth to know who his children are, and he wants to bring shalom to the earth, and he's using his children to do that. So that brings us to the really tough question, which is how? How do we become peacemakers? Not keepers or admirers or peace prayers. Those are all good, but Jesus said peacemaker. How do we go about that? Well, we need to first, I guess the first thought that occurred to me was, well, we can start by not contributing to the chaos. We could just refrain from, making more chaos. And that's actually harder than it sounds. But when you're thinking about this, that's certainly a good start, is not contributing to or creating more chaos. But Jesus, I believe, was clear in saying, you need to go where there is no peace and bring peace. And so how do we do that? And this is where the conversation part of it really took place, and we don't have the benefit of that conversation in this recording. But some of the thoughts and the questions and discussion that we had, I'll just share with you. And one is, when you hear the word peacemaker, does anyone specific come to mind, either from history or maybe just somebody you know in your community or family or church or whatever? And why? What makes them the peacemaker? What attributes do they have? What qualities do they have that makes you think of them as a peacemaker, and how is that something that you can replicate, that you can take and use yourself? I know I thought of like Martin Luther King, as somebody who was a peacemaker. I mean, he was in a volatile situation where there was great injustice, but he was adamant about grounding his message in God's word and having it be nonviolent when there was every pressure and stress on it to become violent. And he was actively making peace, addressing a very difficult situation, but by making peace. And there are plenty of others that we discuss, but that's one way to approach it. Another was, is it enough to pray? Is it enough just to pray about peace? And I think it's important to pray. We absolutely need to pray. We're instructed to pray continuously. But I believe Jesus is telling us to take it a step further. And Paul says, this is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 through 20. He gave us the ministry of reconciliation. He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God was making his appeal through us. Again, there's kind of the concept of the co-ruler, right? And I think if we're Christ's ambassadors, then we do need to do something more than pray. And we need to somehow take action. And it doesn't have to be, it's not like I'm saying, okay, everybody needs to go out and shoot for the Nobel Peace Prize. We got to solve the Middle East crisis or bring peace to Afghanistan, or how about just peace in our own country, our own nation, between the different political parties and views. I mean, you can, that would be great, but it doesn't have to be that. I mean, don't make it so that it's almost impossible. There can be small things that you can do that, now that you've thought about this and you understand this is really Jesus' charge to us to become peacemakers, what are some small things that we can do to become a peacemaker? And I'll give you one example that I came across not too long ago that I thought was really effective. So there's an organization called the Civil Righteousness Movement, and it's a faith-based organization. It's founded by an African-American pastor, Christians, and they have chapters in different places in the country, but I think it's based in the Midwest. And I just happened to stumble upon this, and I really loved on their website the reason they came into being, or their motto. And it said, social inequality or inequality requires a civil rights movement, but iniquity requires a civil righteousness movement. So social inequality definitely is an evil, needs to be remedied, and civil rights movement is a good way to do that. But looking at it as a believer in God, a believer in Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount, we have a bigger problem. It's not just inequality, it's iniquity. It's no God in our lives. And in order to do that, in order to remedy that, you need a righteousness movement, a movement that introduces people to the righteousness of God and brings God's righteousness to address the iniquity that we, God's children, have introduced into the world. And one of the videos they have is just fantastic. And it's a situation where this was in the summer of 2020, when there's huge amounts of racial strife going on in our country. And people had protested, and the protests had devolved in many cases into violence and looting and burning, and just a lot of really horrible things. And this took place in a Midwestern city. I can't remember which one, but there was a series of protests that unfortunately had devolved into violence, and they came back a couple of days later and they were going to renew the protest, and things were really tense. So you had protesters, you had lines of police, you had people off, bad people off who were looking to have it go into something more than a protest. And the civil righteousness movement, it was a group of Christians, different churches, different races, different genders. They came together, several volunteers, and they were all wearing a t-shirt, a black t-shirt that just said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," Matthew 5:9. And all they did at this protest, where this tension was really high, it was in the summer in a Midwestern city. It was really hot, and they had big coolers, and they just went to every person and said, "Here's a bottle of cold water." They had coolers full of cold water, and they just went from person to person and said, "Would you like a bottle of water? Would you like a bottle of cold water? Would you like a bottle of water?" No proselytizing, no evangelizing, no, you need to know Jesus. We're the civil righteousness movement. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we want. It was just, do you want a bottle of water? And people started taking the bottle of water, and everyone's like, "Thank you. Yeah, actually I do." And after about an hour or two of handing out cold water to this tense situation, there were people there who said you could just feel the tension come down. You could just feel it. It was just cold water. That's all it was. It's just somebody who said, "I'm a peacemaker, and here's a bottle of water." So it can be small. It can be small. But Jesus has charged us to do this as his children. We are co-rulers, and if we're going to enjoy all of the benefits and the blessing, let's take the responsibilities and the obligations seriously as well. And the result is yet another blessing. We are children of God, and those who don't know him will recognize us as children of God for taking the effort, for making the effort, taking the time to be a peacemaker. All right, that's it for this Bible Study Lite. I hope you can join us in person when we start up in September. We are a little bit behind on recording some of our earlier Bible Study Lites, but we are getting caught up here in the month of July and August of 2021. And you can also download the written material at both the YouTube channel for Kona Bible as well as the Kona Bible webpage. And so until we see each other again on the camera, may God's face shine upon you, and have a blessed day. Thanks.